One of the most fulfilling aspects of being a parent is seeing our children develop new skills, whether they're pursuing a fun hobby, mastering a competitive sport, or taking on almost anything else. It's rewarding to watch them develop and grow. Of course, success is never guaranteed. Many kids end up giving up on their goals due to unforeseen challenges or setbacks. And even worse, these experiences can cause some kids to shy away from future opportunities for growth. Fortunately, the ability to learn is a skill itself that can be developed. So by helping our children adopt best practices and avoid common mistakes, we can help foster their ability to acquire new skills more easily. So let's explore 7 proven tips for helping children learn faster and smarter. Beginning with tip number 1, narrow the scope to accelerate progress. The first priority is getting clear on the most essential part of what it is that a child wants to learn. For example, if they're interested in learning a new language, it's important to be specific about how they intend to use that new skill. Can they get away with simply learning how to speak the language? Or alternatively, should they simply focus on learning how to read and write the language? It's a mistake to take on too much all at once in the name of efficiency, because more often than not, the added workload simply reduces their ability to make progress. In the case of learning a new language, it takes considerably more time to master reading, writing, and speaking at the same time. Therefore, it's much more likely that a child will lose momentum and quit long before seeing real results. So regardless of the goal, look for opportunities to narrow the scope. That way, your child is much more likely to reach a tipping point. That's the point at which their initial results inspire further action, making it much more likely that they will stick with their goal until completion. Of course, later on, after they've completed their initial goal, they can easily layer on related skills and knowledge. So for example, after learning how to speak a new language, they can more easily take on the added challenge of learning to read and write it as well. Let's continue on to tip number 2. Prioritize direct experience early and often. A crucial aspect of learning a new skill is gaining practical experience in the situation or environment in which they plan to use it. So if a child is interested in learning how to develop mobile apps, they must find a way to start working on simple apps as early as possible. If they want to learn a sport like basketball, they should join a pickup game sooner rather than later. And if they want to learn to speak a new language, they should look for opportunities to engage in basic conversations with a native speaker. This direct approach is in stark contrast to the way that many things are taught today. Much of what children learn in the classroom is abstracted away from the real world, and skills are often taught in simplified, isolated environments. As ultra-learning author Scott H. Young explains, directly learning the thing we want feels too uncomfortable, boring, or frustrating. So we settle for some book, lecture, or app, hoping it will eventually make us better at the real thing. Unfortunately, this approach fails to address one of the most significant challenges in education, which is the problem of transfer. Transfer is what happens when a child learns something in one context, such as shooting a basketball in a driveway, and then goes to apply that skill in another context, such as playing a real game. The problem, of course, is that experience in one context often fails to translate into another context. It's one thing for an aspiring basketball player to make shot after shot in a controlled, familiar environment. It's another thing to take a similar shot in a new environment in the face of a strong defender after receiving an awkward pass and being tired from running up and down the court. A great way to avoid the problem of transfer is to engage in the goal activity as early and as often as possible. So rather than having children focus exclusively on isolated skill building, look for opportunities for them to participate in the real activity on a regular basis. This kind of direct experience makes it easier for children to identify skills worth practicing, and it provides them with the perfect opportunity to apply those skills as they are being developed. Now, of course, this may not be an option for every pursuit. Some activities may be too difficult, complex, or even dangerous to take this approach. However, as a general rule, you should be looking to close this gap as quickly as possible. That way, children can focus on applying what it is that they're learning rather than focusing endlessly on skill building. Let's continue on to tip number 3. Address weaknesses through focused practice. As a child gains direct experience, they will inevitably run into challenges or setbacks that cannot be addressed with their current abilities. For example, when learning a new language, they may start by using flashcards to memorize basic conversational phrases. Then, when conversing with a native speaker to gain practical experience, they may discover that some of the phrases are not commonly used. Furthermore, they might encounter several new phrases that they aren't yet familiar with. And while this can be frustrating in the moment, this kind of experience provides the perfect direction for further improvement. At their next practice session, they could focus on removing uncommon words from their flashcards and adding several new phrases in anticipation of their next conversation with a native speaker. Scott H. Young calls this the direct then drill approach. Direct experience provides the foundation for further growth. Once a weakness has been identified, it's time to drill the relevant skills or knowledge in focused practice sessions. Then, as the weakness is addressed, the child can take what they've learned and reapply it within the goal activity. This direct then drill approach can be applied to almost any pursuit. Regardless of the case, the strategy is always the same. Everything begins by identifying the most direct opportunity to engage in the goal activity for the purpose of developing practical experience. Then, as challenges or setbacks arise, the child can engage in purposeful practice for the purpose of refining the skills that prove most useful along the way. Let's continue on to tip number 4. Seek out qualified, actionable feedback. Regardless of what a child is learning, feedback plays an absolutely crucial role. It can make all the difference when it comes to catching mistakes early, adopting best practices, and avoiding stalled progress. Therefore, it's absolutely essential that we look for opportunities for our children to be routinely observed by qualified teachers, coaches, or mentors. The very best kind of feedback is that which addresses current mistakes and guides future action. It should explain exactly what a child is doing wrong and how to fix it. More often than not, this requires a qualified teacher or coach with deep subject matter expertise and a history of successfully guiding other children through the same process. Beyond simple corrective feedback, another powerful resource is what Scott H. Young refers to as meta feedback. As he explains, this kind of feedback isn't about the child's performance, but about evaluating the overall success of the strategy they're using to learn. In other words, rather than identifying specific mistakes they are making, this kind of feedback focuses on the overall approach that the child is using to learn. For example, when learning to speak a new language, using a mobile app may be inferior to using traditional flashcards. Now, naturally, there may be situations where it's impossible to find subject matter experts. Emerging hobbies or interests may be so new as to not yet have qualified teachers or coaches. In such a situation, it can still be beneficial for children to seek feedback from non-experts. And that's because, as a general rule, it's much easier for an outside observer to accurately assess mistakes and point out areas for potential improvement. Now, with that said, their suggestions for correcting the mistakes should always be taken with a grain of salt, because it's much easier for non-experts to identify potential mistakes than for them to necessarily point out the correct approach to address those mistakes. Let's continue on to tip number 5. Build on the experience of top performers. Some pursuits can and should be more structured than others. For example, when it comes to learning how to play the piano at an expert level, there's a clear sense of the order in which new concepts and techniques should be introduced. And the same is true of many other well-understood pursuits, including playing professional sports, mastering games like chess, or even preparing for Olympic-level competitions. In such cases, time is allowed for learning methods to be refined over multiple generations. Experienced coaches can then help their students build on what has worked in the past, adopt best practices, and push things to the next level. This is one reason why experts in many domains continually outperform those in the previous generation. So children should look for opportunities to take advantage of this growing body of knowledge as it relates to their own interests and their own pursuits. Now, with that said, not every pursuit is going to have this kind of history or structure. So if that is the case with what it is that your child is trying to learn, one of the best things they can do is identify the top performers that are available and then seek to understand how it is that they develop their skills, what other skills or knowledge they may have acquired in the past that might contribute to their success, and then just overall trying to figure out how they became so effective at what it is they have mastered. That way, your child can develop their own training techniques designed to replicate their success. Let's continue on to tip number 6. Understand the fundamentals deeply. Another key to effective learning is to understand the basics on a deep level. Therefore, it's important that we encourage our children to dig beneath best practices and surface knowledge to better understand how and why things work the way that they do. In other words, instead of just memorizing common processes for getting things done, it's important to understand how those processes work and why they were established in the first place. When a child understands something on a deep level, they can apply that knowledge to a wider variety of situations, and they can recall details with greater accuracy and learn related concepts much faster. Consider the difference between memorizing complex directions to several restaurants in a new city versus truly understanding the lay of the land. When someone has deep knowledge about a city, they don't have to memorize turn-by-turn directions for every new destination. Instead, they can link new destinations with existing knowledge and add them to their mental map. Now, to be clear, it's absolutely crucial that children adopt and follow best practices, especially when first starting to explore a new area of interest. However, as their knowledge deepens, they should avoid relying on processes or formulas as a crutch, and instead, they should seek to understand how things really work and why those processes were adopted in the first place. Not only can this approach help them identify when a process is flawed or outdated, but it can also help them recognize when it makes sense to break from the rules and improvise to create superior results. So look for opportunities to ask them questions like, why are things done that way? Is that still the best approach today? What else might work better? Let's continue on to tip number 7. Rely on habits instead of willpower. No sudden surge in inspiration or motivation can compete with the progress that results from taking consistent action over an extended period of time. To quote author James Clear, "You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems." Therefore, if a child is serious about improving a skill, we must help them build reliable habits around gaining experience, engaging in practice, and gathering feedback. The goal is to have these essential activities become an automatic part of their daily routine, just like eating, sleeping, or brushing their teeth. Now, a great strategy for initiating new habits is to anchor them to existing routines. As social scientist BJ Fogg explains, you already have a lot of reliable routines, and each of them can serve as an action prompt for a new habit. For example, a child may choose to create a new habit that occurs after their morning shower, after they return home from school, or after cleaning up the dishes in the evening. The right choice will depend on a variety of factors, but one crucial thing to consider is the frequency of the new habit. For example, if a child wants to spend 30 minutes every day learning to speak a new language, well, they should attach that habit to an existing routine that already takes place on a daily basis. Another thing to consider is that certain parts of the day are much more predictable than others. For example, it's often much easier to introduce a new habit early in the morning, even if that means having to wake up much earlier, than it is to introduce that same habit at some point in the evening. And that's because, as a general rule, the evening is much more prone to last-minute changes or unscheduled disruptions. So with that in mind, encourage your children to identify the most predictable part of their day. That way, they can introduce new habits or new routines within that window of time. Okay, let's continue on to one last bonus tip. Use words of praise to encourage children. As you may know, offering words of praise is a powerful way to support the growth of our kids. However, not all forms of praise are beneficial. The right kind of praise can help kids adopt positive behaviors and take on greater challenges, whereas the wrong kind of praise can encourage kids to avoid difficult tasks or even quit when the going gets tough. So I've published a video that covers 4 practical tips for how to praise a child with words. It's a natural follow-up to the tips that we covered in this video, so I encourage you to check it out if you're interested in using praise to guide the growth and development of your child. You can find a link to it right here in the video player, as well as down in the video description text.